So something that's always a challenge for people coming to Tufts and learning the way we do things is understanding priority. We're all taught this rote memorization, power, then strength movements, then accessory movements, da 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 da. Maybe nowadays it's like warm up, roll out, warm up, do some mobility, do some activation, start your power movements, etc. That's not a bad answer, but the answer shouldn't be the same year round. So what we want to really talk about is, what does priority mean? And what this comes down to is a bunch of factors. When we say priority, what we're talking about is when we lay out our movement patterns, right? We use the big six here. So hip, we're saying in this phase, quad, let's say horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull. Now, I'm not sure what sport that would be that has horizontal pull over push if in the same phase with that priority, but we're just going to run with this. This is our movement pattern for whatever phase we're in. All right. How do we reflect this when we write our program? Well, the common process, again, to write a program is to say power up front, big strength, smaller stuff here, accessory, etc., go down that way. That's not wrong, and for power phases, even for max strength phases, you're along the right path, but for a lot of our year, that's not our goal. All right, so regardless of the phase we're in, let's pretend we don't know what phase we're in. These are sort of some of the biggest things we can look at to elicit this or to reflect priority. So what I mean is, if priority is hip, I can prioritize hip by sequence. So what does that mean? Let's say I have an A, a B, and a C day. I can have my first movement be hip dominant on all 3 days, right? It could be first in the workout, then I could have a quad dominant movement, and I could follow my own protocols from above all the way down. So every day could look like that. That's not wrong. You have reflected hip dominance by sequence, by putting your hip dominant movement or movements first. The drawback to that is that each day will have similar overall patterns, and generally I think we'd all agree that by going hip and quad back to back 3 days in a row or 3 days out of 7 like this, that's going to be a large drain on the legs. So we may not want to have hip dominance all the way across in that way by sequence. All right, so we'll come back to sequence in a minute. We can talk more about that. Another way is volume, right? So what is volume? Just sets and reps. I can have a hip dominant movement, and let's say in this phase I have 20 total work sets. Why? Because I just made that number up. I could give hip dominant 10 of those work sets, and I could give quad, I'm making this up, 3, and I could give everything else, everything else 7 sets. All right, that certainly will give me hip dominance by volume because my sets are so high. I can have hip dominance by load. So in other words, I can do all my hip movements could be exercises like I could have deadlift here, right? Classically heavy loaded movement, and RDLs here. And I could have, what's another big heavy hip one? I could have a loaded king deadlift, maybe with limited range or something like that. Again, I'm just throwing stuff out there. Maybe even a power clean is a better example. But right, I could have those movements. Naturally, those movements are going to allow me to do a lot of load, and my other movements could be smaller things for all the other groups going down. So that would allow me dominance by load, or priority by load. Tempos, depending on the phase I'm in, I can mess with the tempos. So my hip dominant movement in a stability control phase, I could have really exaggerated slow tempos for all my hip dominant movements, and my other exercises could have more middle of the road tempos. If I was in a power phase, my hip dominant movements could all have X's, right? And my other movements could have quick tempos, but maybe like 201s or other fast speed tempos that aren't as explosive or aren't as loaded or don't involve a launch. So you can manipulate that to whatever you're doing, but you can prioritize it by tempo. That generally would be probably a priority in more functional hypertrophy, stability control, less so as we go down the other end of the chart. I can prioritize my exercise by form, so I can do perfect deadlifts, right? Absolute textbook perfect deadlifts. Or maybe I'm on the other end of the spectrum, I want more loading. I can prioritize my form into allowing some cheat. Maybe you tap and go off the floor. Maybe you put a 1-inch plate under those deadlifts, change the exercise form up a little bit. Finally, focus. Now this is probably something that's harder to arrange in a college weight room, but much easier in your own weight training. So I can go into a set and I can just pick up my bar and I can lift it. Or I can sit down before the set, I can visualize the lift. I can stand up, remove some of the warm gear I've got, dump some cold water down the back of my neck, sniff some smelling salts, have my partner slap me, tighten up my wrist straps, chalk up, and go make a production out of this thing. As strength coaches, we commonly laugh about the athlete who goes and makes a giant production. But it's the same thing as being in the batter's box, tapping each shoe, resetting your gloves, whatever it might be. If you have a routine and you utilize that routine to psych yourself up, you can increase your focus or your arousal level to get a better exercise. So you can prioritize with any of those things. So you could have a program that has, across the week, 10 sets of hip, 12 exercises of quad, and I'll just say 11 of everything else. But yet, it could still be hip focused if your sequencing was hip dominant, your volume, so your sets are low, but your reps might be higher depending on what you're doing. Probably more likely your load was dominant, you used a more aggressive tempo, you had specific form, or you increased your focus. So there's lots of variables, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but there's lots of ways to prioritize those things in those phases. All that said, and I think we said this in the other video, we'll talk about it again, this is the absolute best way because this allows for everything else. If I come in, assuming I'm warmed up, I've fired up my musculature, I've turned on my central nervous system, I've mobilized, I've activated, whatever words we want to use in this current climate, I'm ready to attack my training. If by sequence I put that thing first, whatever I'm trying to get good at, I will get my best results as opposed to putting it last. All right, it's just the way it works. Okay, so let's say I have this hip dominant protocol. I have hip before quad, before the pushes. How do I want to lay this out in an ABC? Well, again, not knowing the phase that I'm in, I'm very likely going to look at hip sequence first. So I'm going to make my hip dominant movements probably my A and my C day. I'm going to switch back to this pen because that's not writing well. So my hip dominant movements will probably come first on my A and C day. But I probably won't do hip dominant again on B day, only because it's possible I might, but we're really going to be over-exaggerating that hip dominance, and I'm probably going to give quad in my second place a little bit more of a role here. Now we all know tons of carryover between quad and hip. So I might come back and do some quad training here, or I might not do any quad training here. This is where you have to decide how you want to lay it out. It's probably going to depend on what phase I'm in as to how many hip dominant exercises I have, how many sets, etc. So when you break it down, you're likely not going to have that thing first on every day. But I'm almost certainly going to have it first on my Monday. I'm probably not going to have it first, but could on my B day or my Wednesday. I'm likely going to have it first or prioritize in some other way on my Friday if it is my true priority. If this is a sport where those two are closer, and my prioritization is really hip just more than quad, I might go hip quad, hip quad. Now I have a slight more prioritization of hip over quad, but my volume might actually come out to be the same. But because, let's say I do 5 sets, 5 sets, 4 sets, 4 sets. My volume is absolutely the same. But because this exercise comes before this exercise, I'm going to have more in the tank and I'm going to get more out of these sets. Likely I'm going to have more load or be better able to stay on my tempo or be able to have more focus, have better form in those exercises. The longer I go into a workout, the more these things break down, which is why we power clean at the end in stability control and we power clean at the beginning in power. Okay. How you lay out the rest, though, is really tricky for people to sort of figure out. So I think we're going to pull back now and look at a phase, a way to describe these phases from stability control up to power and looking at those 6